All right, we got about 30 seconds left as Rose prepares. This is at the very start, very exciting with Rose out in Florida. So as she's getting prepared, we'll get started. How's everyone doing? How's the Q&A? I see you guys in the chat box and engaging. I love all the answers. It's fantastic. I have some great questions that came to me, so I look forward to asking them. So looks like Rose is up. I'm just waiting for her to show herself.
Can you not see me?
I can now.
Oh, all right.
All right. How you doing, Rose?
I am great. I am thrilled to be here this morning.
Fantastic. Are you getting the takeaways that you know, as much as I have?
Absolutely. I love, I know all these folks. I feel honored to be presenting with them today, and I just love to always continuously learn from them. So great opportunity.
Awesome. Awesome. Rose, well, it's great to have you. I'm looking forward to hearing you speak. So take it away. The Zoom stage is yours.
Okay, thank you. So today I will be talking about culture, something, sort of near and dear to my heart, and something that we're talking an awful lot about these days. As great leaders, we know that in order to have a great company, we have to be able to understand and live our desired culture, right? It's crucial. We also know that in this time of the pandemic, it's really wreaked havoc on our internal culture and our brands. And in this time of this sort of shifting workforce, this virtual workforce, sometimes isolating workforce, and the continuing stresses and pressure of the pandemic, it's really shined a light on corporate culture. And it's in these times of crisis, it's in times of crisis that what really gets exposed in our organization are those values and behaviors, right? It's how we make decisions. It's how we treat our employees. It's how we treat our customers, the impact we're having on our community, right? It's all of those things that really get seen in the time of crisis. And so ultimately, it's our culture that can either anchor us or it could be our downfall. So as CEOs and executives, we're talking an awful lot about culture, right? And we're really thinking, what is our culture? Do we have the best culture? Do we have an inspiring culture? Do we have an inclusive and diverse culture? We want the best culture, but really just what does that mean? And let me advance my slides here. And so here's what I find interesting is that for something that's got so much importance as it should and focus, culture still seems to be this somewhat elusive or mysterious thing that sometimes is difficult for us to really grasp. And so I want all of you, I'd love to ask you this question in the chat box. How do you define culture? What does culture mean to you? Go ahead and share some of that in the chat box. What does culture mean to you? As you're sharing some of that, we seem to, right, have a sense of what it is, but we often define it a little bit differently. But the reality is, right, every company has culture. Whether or not we have been intentional about defining the culture, whether we've been intentional about documenting the culture or communicating the culture, we all have culture, and every company has values because they're just inherently who we are. So while our company has these things, if we're not doing the work to really define what our culture is, to define what those values are, to really articulate them, then our culture will just sort of be what it is. It will morph, it will change, but we'll never really have a grasp of what our company stands for. And therefore, neither will our employees, neither will our customers, and neither will the community that we live in. So I just want to talk first a little bit more about why culture is important. And I'm going to use an example here. So let's start with why culture is so important. If you think about Starbucks, right, they're a $25 billion organization. On average, they sell about $3 cups of coffee, which means they have to sell 8 billion coffees a year. And we can ask ourselves, what is it that makes Starbucks so successful? And you can think about it in terms of the analogy, you've probably all heard it or used it, but culture eats strategy for breakfast. So let's think about that. Is what makes Starbucks successful the big decisions, the strategy that they have? Or is it possibly the culture that they have? Those small actions and behaviors of the team, of their people, that happens every day. So is it the type of store that Starbucks is? Is it the location of the store? Is it their great coffee supply chain model? Is it those things that makes Starbucks successful? Or is it, the atmosphere they create? When you walk in, they're smiling at you, right? They call you by your name. They've got great music. They're clean. You feel a little hip when you're in there, right? They've really created an atmosphere. So you'd ask, is it the strategy that makes it successful or the culture? And you could say it's both, right? In this case, Starbucks has a very well-crafted strategy and a well-executed culture. So you could say it's both. I would ask you just to think one step further and say to yourself, Starbucks has lower cost competitors out there. As a consumer, I've got other options. I could go to my local shop and get a much lower cost cup of coffee. I could actually brew a cup of coffee at my home, but it's not the same experience, right? I don't feel that emotion. I don't have an emotional connection. So I find myself back at Starbucks. So at the end of the day, it's culture that made the difference. And I just want you to think that others can duplicate and replicate your strategy, but people cannot duplicate what is and who is uniquely you, right? Okay, so we hear a lot about this, right? Culture this, values that, but just what is culture? What are values? And what is the difference between the two? So simply said, culture is living our values. Right? Culture is what happens when nobody is looking. At the end of the day, as a leader, as a company, we can only control so many things. So if we want the organization to be successful consistently, and where we can't control things, we need to make sure that our teams understand not only what we do, but how we do what we do and why we do what we do. I think maybe there are some black parts covering my screen. I'm going to keep going unless someone tells me that it's totally covered. Hopefully, you just keep listening. I have more of a story to tell. But it's really about then making sure that our team members understand what's behind their actions and what's behind what they do. So I want you to think about it like this. Values are the written words, and culture is how you live those written words. And this is actually sometimes where I see companies go astray a bit, right? So oftentimes I'll see where an organization has their values written down, right? They might be posted in the lobby, they're on their website, maybe even every employee has a nice laminated card with their values written on them. That's great, but living those values are something completely different. So what I want to walk you through today, because culture is the living of our values, I want to focus on values, and I'm going to give you some observations and some learnings and some ways that you can articulate and embed and live your culture and your values in your organization every day. So before I do that, I do want to just take a moment of reflection and ask you, as leaders, as CEOs and executive teams, are you managing your culture? So ask yourself, and I want you to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not at all, 10 being we are the kings and queens of our culture. I want you to ask yourself, have you been intentional about your core values? Does your team regularly have vibrant culture conversations? And do you spend quality time on culture, just like you do on strategy? So ask yourself those questions and give yourselves a rating 1 to 10. Go ahead and put that in the chat box. If you're not brave enough to put it in the chat box, at least write it down, because I'm actually going to circle back to this in a few minutes. Okay, so I'm going to give you some framework about articulating, embedding, and living the values. So let's talk about articulating values. And first, I want to note that I didn't say creating values. You can't create your values, right? Articulating your values is about, I'm going to try to change something so that maybe we can fix. Let's see, maybe that is helping. Let's see if that helped. Okay, I'm gonna keep going, but you can't create your values. It is about, it's really about articulating your values and about being introspective and identifying the things that are alive in your organization today, the things that are alive in your company today, pulling out the things that you like and articulating those things. So it's not just coming up with words that we think sound good, but it's really articulating those things that are already there. When it comes to values, it's not about creating, it's about articulating the best of who you are. So the next on articulating values is who. So whose job is it to articulate your values? And I would tell you that it's primarily, right, this responsibility falls on the shoulders of the CEO. But it's not the CEO's job alone, because values aren't the CEO's values and they aren't the founder's values. They are the values of the group, right? Our organizations are made up of people with hearts and minds and spirits. And as people, we have a desire to have a sense of belonging. We have a sense of belonging, and we want to feel connected and emotionally connected. So we can't just come down from the top and state what our values are. We really need to be inclusive. So when you are articulating your values, make sure that you are inclusive. And then how do we articulate our values? So there's lots of words to choose from, right? There's lots of words in the dictionary, but my advice is living your values needs to start with articulating them in a livable way. So the words we use here matter a lot, and we want to make sure we're using human actionable words, right? Think in terms of verbs, think in terms of using phrases or words that someone can inherently interpret what the behavior is that's expected of them. So that's about how you articulate your values. And then let's talk about how many. And I get this question a lot: how many is the right number of values? And so what I would say is, and you may have heard this before, right? As human beings, psychologists say we can remember 7 plus or minus 2 things. So I would tell you that's your range. Somewhere between 5 and 9 values is the right number of values. 9 values might be sort of leaning on the edge of reasonable number for people to remember. 5, you want to be careful that you're not sort of combining and narrowing down so much that you just have an overarching word that doesn't have that emotional connection. But that's how to think about the number of values. So now I want to tell you a story about a client that I've been working with, and as reference, these were their values. So I will admit, not exactly, this is an infographic that I'm sharing, if you can see it, but they're really basic, right? I mean, it's good they went through the exercise and they had values, but this is what they look like. And so when we got to working together, I was working with the CEO and the executive team, and we started to talk about some of their challenges. And they had challenges with retention, and they had challenges with finding the right people. They admittedly had challenges with some team behavior and dynamics, including among themselves. And they were lacking a creative energy for the future of the organization. And so we started the conversation around culture and values. And before I could even get the words out of my mouth, in terms of culture and values, what they said was, don't worry, Rose, we already have, our values done. They're done. Didn't you see them in the reception area? And I thought, okay, great. I'd like you to do one thing. Before we meet again, I'd like you each to go and ask one or two of your team members, what are the company values and what do they mean to them? And so they came back 2 weeks later and they shared, they were a bit hard pressed to find anybody who could articulate what their values were or what the meaning of the values were. So we, as a team, decided it was time to re-explore the core values, and they kicked off what they called a values refresh. And I just want to share with you the process that we went through. And so in the spirit of being inclusive, the CEO grabbed about 12 people from his organization, people who seemed to have a real caring for the business, and he invited them to lunch, and he shared with them what we were up to. We want to articulate our values. And so he asked them questions, questions like, what do we like about working with each other and our interactions? What do we like about, what kind of people do we want to have in the organization? And they brainstormed and they came up with about 70 items. So the CEO said, thank you very much. And he went back and, saw himself as the editor or the curator of these values. And he went to work on grouping them and narrowing them down. And 2 weeks later, he brought the group back together again. At that point, he had about 20 values. And he sat down with them again and asked, okay, which of these are good and which of these aren't so good? Went through the process again. You can see it's a very iterative process to make sure that they're really meaningful to the group. So went through that process again, came back one last time to the team, with 9 or 10 values, and asked the question, which of these couldn't you live without, and which of these could you live without? And ultimately, they narrowed it down to 5, and what they came up with were these new values. So you can see where they began to articulate their values in a different way, right? They used different words. They used human actionable words that resonated with them. Things like be humble, start with why, do the right thing. And in fact, now these values belonged to the group. And so when they kicked off these refresh values with an all hands meeting, we actually leveraged those 12 people to help communicate these values. So this is really how you articulate the values. I'm going to talk now briefly about, great, we've got them articulated. How do we embed them or make them relevant in the organization? I'm going to just touch on a few processes to think about. One, most obvious, is the HR processes. And this might seem simple and straightforward, but sometimes it's overlooked. And the point here is that we want to make sure that our values are embedded in every part of the process, right? When you think about even how you're marketing for recruiting, how are you attracting the right fit? Make sure in your interviewing and hiring process, how are you assessing for the right fit? In your performance management systems, yes, it's about skills and results, but how are you evaluating folks around their behaviors, actions, and attitudes? We all know that employee who yes, delivers results, but they've alienated everybody in their organization. So you want to make sure that we've got a way to assess that. And then in all development plans, right? So in your development plans, are we not only, maybe recognizing where there's opportunity for improvement, but also highlighting where they've got real strength in the actions and behaviors that they're showing so that we can leverage them in an organization. And you can get creative with it. So I want to share a quick example. So, a lot of us, you may be familiar with Zappos. I might be too familiar with them, but they are a company who's been very intentional about their culture, and they're very intentional about cultural fit. And so this is just an example. They have a value, create fun and a little weirdness. And so in their interviewing process, they've created questions. How weird are you on a scale of 1 to 10? And the higher, the better. And what is something weird that makes you happy? So this is just an example, but making sure, the point is that we are embedding and making relevant our values across all of our HR processes. The next area to think about is management. And, everyone talking today has talked about the difference between leadership and management. And here it's around making sure that we've got management processes that really embed the values. So 2 that I'll highlight here, which number 1 is around coaching. And I'm talking about the CEO coaching the executive team and the executive team coaching their team, because oftentimes with values, it's about behavior and attitude. And so those things are difficult to sometimes change or shift. And so it's that ongoing coaching and dialogue around those things that are so important. So, intentionally coaching is a management process to consider. And then another process is about public accountability. So making sure that we are living those values and behaviors and calling it out when we see it in others. So those are some examples of some management processes. And then it's about embedding your values in your communications. So, this is really around thinking strategically about what you're communicating within an organization and embedding and making relevant and connecting your values to those things. In the example of the CEO that I shared, we had a very strong kickoff meeting, right? We shared those values and we rallied the hearts and the minds and the spirit of the team around those values. Then they're talked about at every town hall. They're brought up in the newsletters. There's public recognition for those folks that are living the values. They've even created a playbook of values. So when they catch somebody doing the right thing, we've created a playbook where we've actually documented what that value looks like when it's alive in the organization. So those are some ways about communication, but bottom line is making sure that you've embedded and made relevant these values across all of these systems within your organization. And then lastly, I'm just going to talk about living the values. And so all of those things that we talked about before, if we're not living our core values, they're not going to stick. And so all I want to say here is that this is sort of a hard stop for me, right? It's you, it's us as leaders and executives. If it's our responsibility to be accountable to the values, it's our responsibility to be living the values and breathing life into these values every single day, because even Mani said it, right? People do what they see, not what you say. So take a listen to this.
A true leader doesn't just lead, but inspires others to chase a common set of values. They set the tone and create an environment that others can express their hidden talents. Innovation becomes a strategy that pulls the mission closer to the goal. They help others open their mind to possibilities that drive success. There was a young executive of a public exchange company that was founded on great culture. And this is the reason she gave her sweat, blood, and tears to see the company's vision come to life. As senior leadership changed and her career grew, she realized it was now her turn to be the guardian of the culture. Integrity and discipline would have to help her lead the way. As she started her journey, she came across a story about the redwood forest and the secrets behind its success. These redwood trees stand 200 feet tall and are over 2,000 years old. They have encountered dangerous windstorms, fierce lightning and thunder, and forest fires. But the secret behind the growth intrigued her. She learned that the trees had deep roots that hold their foundation. But it's not just a single tree's roots that make it strong. These tall, seasoned trees entangle their roots with other trees around them to form an unbreakable core. This has helped them stand the test of time. One tree alone could be toppled over, but together, no outside threat could harm them. This helped the woman come to the conclusion that to build a company that could stand the test of time, they would have to have a core set of values. A grounded foundation that is built on trust, integrity, and support. A team that works together will always outweigh an individual. She vowed to lead like this to create a common goal that inspires and creates innovation. She would strengthen the roots to build something that developed an infinite mindset and provide hope to the people she leads. But true leadership will find a way to unite a team that can weather any storm.
Okay, so one last thing, just reflect again, ask yourself, have you been intentional about your core values? Does your team regularly have vibrant culture conversations? Do you spend as much quality time on culture as you do on strategy? And last, I've added and asked, are you committed to being the guardian of your culture? So your next steps, go out and articulate your values. If you're getting started on your values now, or it's about refreshing your values, make sure they're embedded across your organization and relevant, and make sure that you're living those values every single day. And with that, I will turn it back over to Angie.
Great, Rose. Awesome. Awesome. All I can say is, wow. Articulate, embed, live the values. That's so powerful in an organization. Thank you for those insights. Take a moment to put in your top takeaway from Rose today.